J.D. Vance was not a big fan of social events. Politics had always seemed to him a serious business, requiring focus and strategic thinking, not the endless exchange of fake smiles surrounded by the rich and showbiz stars. But on this evening, he had no choice. The charity dinner was organized by one of the largest business foundations in the country, and his presence was necessary. The event took place in the opulent ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. Huge chandeliers, soft lighting, gold-trimmed walls, everything screamed wealth and status. Guests arrived in expensive suits and designer dresses, sipping champagne and making small talk that often had no real meaning. J.D. arrived on time, although he was not eager to spend the evening in the company of people who cared more about their image than about the real problems of the country. He walked through the room, shaking hands lightly with familiar faces, nodding to politicians who tried to strike up short conversations with him. He knew that such evenings were necessary. They provided an opportunity to make useful contacts, to discuss important issues informally, but still he felt like an outsider. The charity that organized the event was raising money to help low-income families, and at least the purpose of the evening was worthy. But as J.D. watched the rich and famous pose for pictures, he couldn't help but think that for many of them, the dinner was just another opportunity to show that they cared for ordinary people without doing anything meaningful. The music was soft and the waiters moved deftly among the guests, passing around snacks and drinks. J.D. took a glass of water, avoiding champagne. He preferred to keep a clear head, especially at such events. There was laughter all around, and conversations about the latest Hollywood premieres, new deals on Wall Street, trendy restaurants that were must try. J.D. smiled faintly as he watched the commotion. He had grown accustomed to the elite living in their own world, far removed from the concerns of ordinary Americans. Suddenly, he felt someone tap him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, J.D.," a familiar voice said. J.D. turned to see Senator Mark Randolph, a powerful Republican politician known for his connections in business circles, standing in front of him. "Mark," J.D. nodded, shaking the senator's hand. "How's the evening?" "As always," Randolph chuckled. "Everyone pretends they're here for a good cause, but they're really just showing off." J.D. raised an eyebrow. "Have you become a cynic?" "No, just a realist," the senator replied, looking around the room. "But you understand everything yourself." J.D. just nodded. He knew there was little sincerity in politics, especially in places like this. The conversation was interrupted by the voice of the evening's host, who announced the beginning of the official part. The guests slowly made their way to the tables, and J.D. took his place next to several famous businessmen and actors. He listened to the speeches of the organizers, stories about how the foundation helps poor families, about the importance of supporting social initiatives. It all sounded good, but J.D. knew that after dinner, most of these people would simply return to their normal lives, forgetting about the problems they had just talked about. But this evening wasn't just another boring dinner. He didn't know it yet, but the press would soon be storming the room, and he would have to face a journalist who would try to catch him on every word. But J.D. was ready. He was always ready for a fight. The guests were already seated at the tables, the waiters were serving food, and it seemed that the evening had finally entered the phase where you could just dine and not worry about the need to make small talk. J.D. Vance did not particularly like such events, but he knew that they were an inevitable part of his life. He raised his glass of water, pretending to listen to another speech from the stage, but his attention was focused not on the speeches, but on the general atmosphere of the evening. Everything was too controlled, too perfect. Rich people discussing the poor, having nothing to do with them, celebrities talking about social responsibility, but doing so in front of flashing cameras so that their words would be recorded for the news. But something had changed. J.D. felt a slight tension in the air. He noticed people turning toward the doors, and it soon became clear that journalists had entered the room. They had appeared suddenly, as if on cue, their cameras already on, microphones raised, their eyes focused on the most influential guests. J.D. sighed. He knew it would happen sooner or later. Any major event is always a magnet for the media, and a charity event with celebrities and politicians simply couldn't happen without them. The only question was what their mood would be. Were they there to cover the event or to provoke? At first, journalists pounced on the Hollywood stars, peppering them with questions about politics, their latest roles, whether they really consider themselves part of the fight for justice or just doing it for the sake of image. Some guests were clearly irritated by such attention, while others, on the contrary, began to give interviews with joy, realizing that this was their chance to shine in the press once again. JD watched the proceedings while continuing to eat, but he knew he couldn't stay away for long. He saw one of the journalists, a tall man in an expensive but slightly sloppy suit, making a deliberate approach to his table. This wasn't just any random reporter, but one of the well-known liberal journalists whose articles regularly appeared in major publications and were often directed against conservatives. JD immediately realized that this man did not come here for an objective report. "Mr. Vance?" The journalist smiled, though there was no real goodwill in his smile. "May I ask you a couple of questions?" JD looked up and met his gaze. "Why not?" he answered calmly, although he already had a premonition of what the conversation would be like. The journalist leaned forward slightly, as if waiting for the right moment, and then asked the first question. "Do you think it is fair that such events are held in luxury hotels when millions of Americans live below the poverty line?" JD looked at him, paused, then smiled. "An interesting question, but let me clarify. Are you here as a journalist covering an event, or as a person who wants to create another scandal?" Some of the guests at the table turned slightly, listening to the dialogue. The journalist did not expect JD to attack him with his first answer, but he quickly pulled himself together. "I'm here to ask questions that people want answers to," he said, maintaining a smile. "Really?" JD took a sip of water and leaned a little closer. "Then let's be honest. I don't see anyone sitting here eating at someone else's expense. All of these people have done something to achieve their success, and this dinner raised millions of dollars for charity. If you're worried about the income gap, maybe we should start with Hollywood. After all, that's where actors get millions for a role, and the workers on the set get pennies. Or do you not care?" The journalist blinked, but quickly continued. "You say that this money goes to charity, but isn't there an element of hypocrisy in this? Wouldn't it be better to simply send these funds to people instead of throwing an expensive dinner?" JD chuckled. "So, in your opinion, people who have money have no right to meet to discuss how to help those who need it? Or are you proposing a tax on dinners?" There was a slight chuckle in the room. The journalist felt that he was losing control of the situation. "I'm just asking, isn't this just PR?" JD nodded, pretending to think about it. "Good question. Let me ask you in return. When you write your articles exposing the rich and famous, do you do it for free? Or do you get paid for it?" The journalist narrowed his eyes slightly. "What are you getting at?" "The point is, if you want to talk about hypocrisy, let's start with you," JD replied calmly. "You're standing here, in an expensive suit, with a professional camera, working for a publication owned by a media mogul. And you're telling me about social inequality. Isn't that hypocrisy?" A small wave of whispers ran through the room. Several people watching the conversation were clearly enjoying the way JD was picking the journalist apart. "I'm just doing my job," the journalist replied, but there was much less confidence in his voice now. JD shrugged. "Me too. And my job is to respond to provocations. So thank you for an interesting conversation, but if you don't have any really important questions, maybe you'll let me finish my dinner?" The journalist pressed his lips together for a second, but realized that he had lost. He had failed to irritate JD, had failed to corner him. Instead, he had been the one forced to retreat by logic and common sense. JD returned to his dinner, pretending that the conversation hadn't affected him at all. He was used to being picked on at events like this. But this time was different. Because this time he didn't just respond, he made a point. The journalist took a step back, but his eyes betrayed his irritation. He had not expected that J.D. Vance would not only remain calm, but would also turn the situation against him. His entire plan had collapsed the moment the vice president had not made excuses but had gone on the offensive. But this man was a professional provocateur. He could not afford to simply leave, losing face. He exhaled, quickly pulled himself together, and made another attempt. Okay, he said, feigning a slight smile. I'll ask another question that will definitely interest your constituents. JD took a sip of water and leaned back, making it clear he was in no hurry. I'm listening to you. You talk about social justice, about everyone having equal opportunities, but your party is against raising taxes on billionaires. Why then is this dinner being held at the expense of the very people you are against? JD put his glass on the table and looked at the journalist with a slight grin. Let me clarify. Do you think that people do not have the right to spend their hard-earned money the way they want? The journalist shook his head slightly, feigning bewilderment. I think if they really want to help the poor, they could just give the money directly. JD chuckled. Okay. How much money have you personally donated to charity this year? The journalist hesitated. I'm here to ask questions, not answer them. That's the problem, JD said calmly. You didn't come here for answers. You came here looking for a scandal. A tense silence fell over the room. The guests, who had been simply watching their dialogue, now became openly interested. Several cameras turned towards JD and the journalist, capturing every detail of their verbal duel. JD looked his opponent straight in the eye. Let me explain to you how this works. This evening raised millions of dollars to help families who need support. The people in this room used their influence and resources to organize this event. Instead of asking why they did it, you should be asking why you didn't. The journalist opened his mouth to say something, but JD didn't give him a chance. You want to talk about hypocrisy? Great. Let's talk about your industry. About how the biggest media corporations make billions by manipulating public opinion while pretending to be defenders of ordinary people. About how movie stars who are now standing for social justice fly in private jets and live in mansions worth hundreds of millions. About how you yourself came here in an expensive suit and with a microphone in your hand to make money on this story. The journalist tensed, realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. You tried to convince people that rich people can't do good because they're rich. But you know what? Being poor doesn't automatically make a person right, just as being rich doesn't automatically make a person wrong. At that moment, applause broke out. It was unexpected. Some of the guests sitting nearby nodded to JD in respect. Some smiled. Even some of the journalists, who had initially been simply filming a report, could not hide their interest. The journalist, realizing that he was losing, tried to change the subject. Okay, but isn't your policy aimed at protecting the interests of the rich, not the common people? JD chuckled. Not true. My policy is to give people the opportunity to decide for themselves what to do with their money, rather than handing it over to bureaucrats who spend it ineffectively. The journalist froze. He understood that every word he said was now being turned against him. JD leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you one more question. Do you think that if a person has earned his fortune by honest work, he should feel guilty for it? The journalist thought about it. No, but... Great, JD interrupted. Then maybe you could tell me why big media companies are owned by billionaires, but their journalists still lecture others about social justice. Laughter rang out in the room. It was now obvious that the journalist had lost. He tried to pretend that the discussion had not affected him, but his flushed face spoke for itself. He clutched the microphone, took a short breath, and said quickly, "Thank you for your answers, Mr. Vance." He turned and, without waiting for a continuation, quickly left. JD leaned back calmly and took another sip of water. I don't think he expected this outcome. Senator Mark Randolph, sitting next to him, said quietly. JD chuckled. They never calculate. The guests at the table began to quietly discuss what had happened. Some continued to applaud, some recorded what had happened on their phones, some simply shook their heads in surprise. But the main thing was different. JD didn't just respond to provocations. He destroyed them. After the reporter left, JD Vance allowed himself a brief pause. He calmly took another sip of water and glanced at those around him. Their reactions spoke volumes. Some of the guests were clearly enjoying what had just happened. Some were smiling sheepishly, others were nodding their approval. Even those who hadn't paid attention to the conversation at first were now looking in his direction. But there were others. Those who sat in tense silence. They did not applaud, did not smile, did not express obvious approval. These were people who did not expect the conversation to take such a turn. Some of them clearly sympathized with the journalist, others simply did not like it when someone upset the usual script. JD knew he had just won an important battle, but the war was not over. In the world of politics, there are never final victories. Every day brings a new challenge, a new attack, a new reason for scandal. Senator Mark Randolph sat next to him. He leaned slowly toward JD, still smiling. "I think you should go to events like this more often," he said quietly. JD chuckled. "Do you think they liked the show?" "Some," Mark nodded. "But others, clearly not so much." JD turned his head slightly and saw several people talking animatedly in the corner of the room. Among them was another journalist who had just spoken to someone on the phone. His face was gloomy, his lips pursed. "They didn't like it," JD noted. "Of course I didn't," Mark chuckled. "You just destroyed their colleague on live TV. They won't let that go." JD chuckled again. Let them try. He knew that now the media would run stories with headlines like, "JD Vance harshly attacks reporter," or "Vice President avoids tough questions." He knew that his words would be taken out of context, and that the morning news would discuss how he had humiliated the free press. But it didn't bother him. He had long since realized that truth had no meaning in a world where people lived by emotions. The guests of the evening gradually returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere in the room had already changed. After what had happened, the conversations became different. Some discussed the dialogue between JD and the journalist, others tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but everyone felt that the evening had acquired a new tone. One of the event organizers, a man in his 50s with an elegant gray beard and a perfect tuxedo, approached JD. "Brilliant work, Mr. Vance," he said with a slight smile. JD looked at him, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Are you talking about charity or the show?" "Both," the man chuckled. "But more about the show, of course." JD chuckled. "I didn't come here for him. Of course. But you know, sometimes such moments are necessary. People love it when someone breaks the imposed rules." JD nodded. "It's just that the media doesn't like it. Let it be so. People will still see who is telling the truth." JD wasn't so sure. He knew the media had the power to create reality. They could ignore this moment, they could twist it, they could turn it against him. But that didn't scare him. He was always ready to fight. At that moment, he noticed that a group of journalists was moving towards him again. There were 3 of them now. "It seems this is not the end," Mark noted, putting down his glass. "Of course not," JD chuckled. "They always come back." The journalists came closer. This time their leader was a young woman with a sharp gaze and a tape recorder in her hands. She was confident, and her eyes showed a desire to rehabilitate the press after her colleague's failure. "Mr. Vance, can I ask you a few questions?" JD turned to face her, keeping his back straight. "Of course. But let's agree right away, if you're going to look for a sensation again, it's better not to waste my time." The journalist did not expect such directness, but quickly pulled herself together. "We're not here for a scoop, Mr. Vance. We want to understand your position." "Great, then ask." She thought for a second, then asked, "After your public confrontation with our colleague, do you think your responses were too aggressive?" JD chuckled. "Aggressive? Did I yell at him? Did I threaten him? No, but… Then what's the problem? I just answered questions. Don't journalists want politicians to answer questions?" The woman bit her lip. JD smiled. "See? It all depends on how you present the situation. You can say that I confidently answered provocative questions. Or you can say that I attacked a journalist. It all depends on your goal." She took a deep breath. So you think the journalist was just trying to provoke you? JD looked into her eyes. I believe that real journalism should seek the truth, not create it. She remained silent. So what will you write? He asked. The journalist looked at her colleagues, then back at JD. I will write that you are not afraid to answer questions. JD nodded. This is closer to the truth. The journalist nodded, then turned off the recorder and left. Mark chuckled. I think you just outplayed her too. JD took a glass of water. No. I just reminded her that journalism is not manipulation. Mark nodded. Do you think she will write it? JD took a sip and grinned. No. But someone will write. And then someone else. And then it will become obvious to everyone. He looked into the hall. His fight is not over yet. But today he won again. JD Vance took a sip of water, looked around the room, and realized that this evening was definitely not what he had originally expected. He had come here expecting to endure a few hours of boring small talk, take a few casual photos with wealthy philanthropists, shake hands with the right people, and then quietly leave. But now he was the center of attention, turning a charity dinner into an arena for an intellectual duel with the press. The journalists who had previously attacked him with provocations now kept their distance, as if assessing his next move. They understood perfectly well that he was not afraid of their questions, that he knew how to answer and knew how to turn the situation to his advantage. Many of them were disappointed. After all, their goal was to create a scandal, drive the politician into a corner, force him to justify himself. But JD had turned the game around, and now they had to find another way to influence public opinion. The guests of the evening gradually began to disperse. Some went out into the hall to collect their coats, some lingered at the bar, discussing what had happened. JD leisurely walked around the room, listening to snatches of conversation. Vance tore that journalist apart without even raising his voice. Is he always this calm? I don't follow politics much, but I will now. He knows what he's talking about. Let's see what they write tomorrow. JD knew this evening would not go unnoticed. Tomorrow the headlines would be different. Some would call him a cool strategist, some would accuse him of arrogance, some would admire his composure. But he didn't worry. He did what he did best. He didn't let his opponents control the conversation. One of the evening's organizers, an elderly businessman with gray temples and a confident posture, approached him. Mr. Vance, I can say that you made this dinner unforgettable tonight. JD grinned and shook his hand. I hope this didn't spoil the atmosphere? On the contrary. The businessman leaned a little closer. People are tired of seeing politicians afraid of the press. Today they saw something new. JD nodded. I'm not afraid of questions. I just don't like manipulation. The businessman smiled. It's a pity that there are few people like you in politics. JD shrugged. Maybe not everyone is ready to answer honestly? They exchanged brief smiles and JD headed for the exit. Senator Mark Randolph caught up with him near the coat check. Well, are you pleased with yourself? JD chuckled. I'm glad I didn't let them control the conversation. Mark laughed. Tomorrow on the news you will either be praised or torn to pieces. JD threw on his coat and turned to face him. They can write whatever they want. The main thing is that people saw everything with their own eyes. Mark shook his head with a grin. You play this game damn well. JD smiled. I just don't play by their rules. He walked out of the building, breathed in the cold air and felt satisfied. Today he had shown again that the truth can win if you have the courage to speak it.